A suspicious fire claims the life of a small-town family man.
He had been burned very, very badly.
We start looking at surge protectors, the wires and everything. We didn't find anything like that.
You start to run scenarios through your head. Why wouldn't somebody wake up when there was a roaring fire right next to them?
Strange discoveries at the scene create new questions.
Usually you can see a burn pattern, but we didn't see nothing like that.
I start to think maybe they were poisoned.
Propofol is going to cause a person to sleep, and a sufficient concentration can lead to death.
The investigation reveals a family in crisis and a killer who will do anything to keep up appearances.
Her son stated that fights were happening more often. She didn't want people to know the truth.
She wanted to appear to be the perfect family, have the perfect home.
She stated very loudly that if she wanted to get rid of someone, she knew she could.
May 5th, 2018. It's a quiet Saturday morning in Centerville, Iowa. But for one local man, the weekend starts with an unexpected emergency.
Someone was leaving Centerville that morning. As he was leaving town, he drove by South Park and noticed smoke coming from the residence.
Centerville is a real close-knit community. Neighbors help each other out. He stopped, tried to see if there was anything he could do to render assistance.
Uncertain if anyone is inside the home, he calls 911.
Fire department, attention Mystic Fire Department. Please respond for mutual aid in Centerville for a house fire.
We knew that this was the home of Tim and Barb Pasa because their kids associated with my kids. As soon as they opened up the door, they was met with a dog that come running out and then heavy black smoke from floor to ceiling. Once they discovered that, they started to advance on down the hallway into the room where they seen some fire in there.
The fire at that point was contained primarily to a master bedroom on the southeast corner of the residence.
We're gonna go check the fire.
The blaze is extinguished before it engulfs the house, but as the smoke starts to settle, firefighters make a gruesome discovery.
They're advising somebody's in there. We need an ambulance. 1033. 10-4.
On the bed, they find the charred remains of a middle-aged man. Although the damage to his body is severe, first responders know the family well enough to recognize the victim is 50-year-old Tim Pasa.
Since we know that there's a body inside of the structure, it changes the content of everything. We got another team together, which ended up doing a search of the entire house because we got more people in here.
Several people tried to make contact with Barb. We didn't know where she was.
They just said that there's 2 kids. Are they accounted for?
We're checking underneath beds. We're checking on top of beds and everything.
We'll go there first. Okay, this room's clear. Bathroom's clear. This room's clear. First floor's cleared. We're going to the basement. Copy that. Going to the basement.
We're checking all the rooms just to clear and make sure that there's nobody else in the house.
She just said that there's 2 kids, and she was just wanting to make sure that they were accounted for.
They wasn't here. Barb, which was Tim's wife, was not in the house. We radioed that to our command, which is outside, let them know we've done a search and nobody else has been found.
It was shocking to me when I received that news that Tim had passed away. I'd known him for a long time, and when I was younger, just out of high school, we'd all spent a lot of time together. It was definitely not the phone call I expected to get that day.
Timothy Dale Pasa was born and raised in Centerville. He attended the only high school in town where he made lifelong friends.
I went to high school with Tim, and he was just an all-around good guy. He's the youngest of 4 children, I believe. Loved music, loved playing the guitar.
Tim and several other guys would come out to my parents' house and set up in the garage. He played the guitar as good as anybody I'd ever seen.
Music, I believe, was Tim's outlet. He ended up being a lead guitar player in a fabulous country band.
At one of his shows in 1999, Tim hit it off with a 25-year-old local named Barbara Glasscock.
Barb grew up in Centerville and graduated from Centerville High School. She worked as a nurse.
Once I got to know her, it didn't take long to realize that she was funny, she was witty.
She was more outgoing than Tim was. And she had told me that she loved to see him on stage. She loved his demeanor. He was calm to her storm. And that was something that attracted her to him.
Barb started showing up at all of Tim's shows, and the two quickly fell in love.
They got engaged in a few months and then got married. And then they started a family. Their son was in my son's class. And the daughter was also in my other son's class.
Tim was a very present father. He was at every single event that I attended. Anytime we spoke, he bragged up his kids. They were doing this and they were doing that.
Even from T-ball days when they played, he would always be, right at the fence watching and cheering on the boys. He was always involved, and his pride of them just shone through. They were his greatest gift.
Both Tim and Barb worked hard to provide for their growing family.
He was always working. He worked at Lockridge for several years and then became an EMT. And then he became a customer representative for Alliant Energy here in town.
Barb worked for Mercy One Medical Center here in Centerville. She was a nurse in the surgical unit.
I felt that she was a very caring nurse. She always seemed like she wanted to be there. She truly cared about the people she was taking care of.
After 11 years of marriage, the Pasas were doing so well that they bought and remodeled a home in an upscale neighborhood.
Barb and Tim seemed to have a great life, and she was so proud of her home. She always had pictures on Facebook. It seemed to be a well-rounded family.
But now, their picture-perfect life has gone up in smoke. Firefighters have just found Tim's dead body in the smoking ruins. Both the police and fire departments are anxious to know how it happened.
People had been trying to call Barb to let her know that the house was on fire, and she didn't answer them.
Once the fire was contained and extinguished, then firefighters at that point removed the body of Tim Pasa from the residence.
They had a lot of trouble with it just because of the size. Tim was a big individual. I just start looking around the room, see if I see anything else. I noticed a candle on the left side of the bed, which would have been opposite side of where we found the victim at. It was actually down on the floor. That was a little suspicious.
We noticed that a smoke alarm inside the master bedroom area was on the ground. The battery was out of the battery compartment, and the smoke alarm was not melted or burned like you would see in a typical fire. We also noticed on the opposite side of the house a separate smoke alarm between the two kids' bedrooms. The battery compartment was open, making it inactive.
These were just some things that kind of stuck out to me as red flags, because this is not normal stuff that you usually see.
You start to run scenarios through your head and start to try to figure out, what could have happened here. Was it an accident or was it purposefully set?
Coming up, Barb Pasa blames herself for her husband's death.
I said, we found a candle in there. Do you know why it was in there? She said, I lit it.
But an autopsy reveals the shocking truth.
They found no smoke inhalation in Tim's lungs.
On May 5th, 2018, police and fire investigators are working to determine the cause of the deadly blaze that killed Tim Pasa at his home. His wife Barb rushes home after learning about the fire.
People had been calling her, but she said that she didn't have self-service where she was, traveling to the soccer game. Eventually, she did answer one from her daughter, who was on the school bus, had received information, too, that their house was on fire.
Once she did finally arrive on scene, I went and made contact with her and advised her of Tim's death. When I relayed that Tim had passed, Barb didn't seem to have any emotion. I think we all chalked it up to shock and overwhelming situations that morning.
People grieve differently. We don't know what's going through her mind at that time. Officers in the fire department started kind of talking with Barb, trying to put together how the things had transpired before she left. She told them that she had left earlier in the morning to go to her kids' soccer tournament. She had stayed up the night. It would have been Friday night, late, until about midnight. She was baking cookies, but making snacks and things like that to take to the soccer tournament. She went to bed, and then about 5:30 a.m. she woke up, again, started making breakfast for the kids to get them ready for their soccer meet. About 6 a.m. the kids woke up. They had breakfast that Barb had prepared for them.
She said she left the residence between 6:50 a.m. and 7 a.m. that morning. It was predetermined that Tim was not going to go to the soccer match that day. When Barb left the residence, Tim was asleep in bed and snoring.
When they ask Barb if she knows why the smoke detectors were disarmed, she says that was her fault.
She said something had burned while she was in the process of baking and set off the smoke alarms. And so she asked Tim to take the batteries out of the smoke alarms until they could get the smoke cleared out of the room. That made sense. I think most of us have probably done that in our house at some point.
I said, we found a candle in there. Do you know why it was in there? She said, I lit it. I don't remember if it was on the bathroom sink or if I put it on the end table in the bedroom. The reason I put it there and I lit it was because the dog was in there and the dog peed on the carpet and it was kind of covering up the smell.
After answering investigators' questions, Barb asks to see her husband's body.
I explained to Barb that Tim was in the ambulance and that he had been burned very, very badly. She was insistent on spending some time with him.
Barb had told Assistant Chief Moore that, I'm a nurse. I've been a nurse for a long time. I've seen things like this. This is my husband, and I want to see him before he's taken away. We see that a lot with family members, that they do want to see their loved ones at the scene rather than maybe later at a funeral home.
I decided to let her go into the ambulance, and I gave her a couple minutes to spend alone with Tim.
When she came out, we were waiting for her, and she was very stoic. I just thought she was in shock. She didn't show a lot of emotion, and I was concerned that when she broke, it was going to be bad.
Anytime there's a death where it's not under doctor supervision, an autopsy is going to be completed to determine the cause of death, to get the answers needed. When I told Barb that an autopsy would be conducted, she became almost mad that it was going to be conducted and she had no say in that. I thought Barb's reaction to that was not typical. I just felt that maybe she was being overwhelmed with everything that had gone on that morning.
Despite Barb's reservations, Tim's body is transported to a funeral home in preparation for the autopsy.
Barb had said she was going to her mom, she was taking the kids there, and that she would be staying there.
At that point, we were not able to determine if the fire was started because of the candle or if it had any relevance to the fire. But we knew where the items were found and located, and it was just something suspicious in nature.
I went back in to look on the end table to see if I could see the markings where the candle actually was setting before it was, in case it was moving up. I could not find it, so it was really, really puzzling to me. We start looking at all the electronic surge protectors, the wires and everything. They look and see if there's any possibility of where that stuff could have shorted out. In this case, we didn't find anything like that.
The fire marshal determines that the candle Barb Pasa put in the bedroom isn't to blame either.
He had told us that, in his opinion, that the fire had burned rapidly, more so on top of the bed, and is also on the side of the bed where Tim was sleeping, which was the opposite side of where this candle was.
Investigators face another mystery.
In a situation like that, whenever there's fire, especially if it's on your person or it's somewhere, you're going to be moving to get away from it.
Even if a smoke alarm didn't go off, the smoke, the heat, and the flames would have woken somebody up. And there was no indication that that happened. And that was another little part of an investigation that piques your interest as to why. Why wouldn't somebody wake up when there was a roaring fire right next to them? Things just kind of started looking a little more suspicious.
Three days after the fire that claimed the life of Tim Pasa, Centerville authorities are hoping an autopsy will provide answers.
The one big question is what is the autopsy going to show us as far as the nature and the cause of death? As part of that autopsy, they do a full examination of the body. They wanted to make sure that there were no obvious signs of death, such as stab wounds, bullet wounds, in general like that. All of those things were ruled out.
While there are no immediate signs of foul play, the medical examiner does note something unexpected.
They found no smoke inhalation in Tim's lungs. That was the key piece of information that we were looking for, because for that to happen, Tim had to have been deceased before the fire.
Barb had told us that when she had left the residence, Tim was asleep in bed and snoring. That was not possible. Tim was already deceased when she left the residence. There was no natural reason, no indication of bad health or heart attack or any such nature. Now we need to determine what actually took place that morning.
That completely changes our investigation into a homicide investigation.
In light of this development, police wonder if Barb's lack of emotion at the scene wasn't shock, but the reaction of a guilty conscience.
You start putting these pieces together that is going to start moving us towards a criminal investigation. I start to think of, something had happened to incapacitate them where they were not able to wake up. Maybe they were poisoned. It was determined that Barb was diabetic, and so we did find a lot of diabetic medication, insulin, syringes throughout the house.
We informed the medical examiner of the vials of insulin that were found at the residence and gave him that information to try to locate in the toxicology report insulin in Tim's body. At that point, they were not able to locate any insulin in the toxicology.
As far as investigators are concerned, Barb is now a person of interest in a potential murder. The question is, what reason could she have to want her husband dead?
Later that night, I was contacted by a family member of the Pasas who advised me that Tim and Barb's son wished to speak with me in regards to the fire and Tim's death. I agreed to meet with Tim and Barb's son later that evening at the Law Center in Centerville. He advised that the evening before the fire, him and his father, Tim, had gone on a walk together, and Tim had expressed to him that they were going to be getting a divorce and that was going to be taking place sooner rather than later. Tim and Barb's son was very distraught and upset. He stated that it hadn't been good for quite some time, that fights were happening more often than not. It was apparent that he truly believed that Barb may have had something to do with Tim's death.
I've been around Centerville my whole life, and there's been very few intentional homicides in this community. But the original picture that you have starts to change. From what we saw at the very beginning to where we were now was substantially different.
Coming up, a marriage on the brink of disaster.
We probably lived paycheck to paycheck. We got behind on our mortgage and had to refinance.
And detectives find the smoking gun.
That conversation led the laboratory to test for a drug called propofol.
Officers now have a suspect in the fiery murder of Tim Pasa, his wife of 18 years, Barbara Pasa. To understand her motive, detectives need to know just how deep the problems in their marriage go.
Generally, you want to speak with friends and family members and try to see what you can come up with. One of those in particular was Sonia Carson. She had reached out and she had some information that she thought maybe we would want to know.
I knew Barb all through when she was in school. 2004, 2005 is when we became closer friends. Barb and Tim were never an affectionate couple. Even when the kids were younger, they never were one to touch each other or show affection. I just thought that was Barb's demeanor. She wasn't really an emotional person. And I think if she would have been more affectionate, Tim would reciprocate that.
According to Sonia, Tim and Barb's relationship continued to deteriorate over the years.
I think they stayed together for the kids, but, primarily just for them. And I think Barb, she did not want to have a marriage that ended in divorce. In her eyes, she would have felt like she wouldn't be accepted or that she wouldn't be able to do things with us as couples as we sometimes did because of our children.
Their relationship seemed to reach a breaking point in 2018, 2 weeks before the fire.
We had gone out to eat one evening, and there were 3 of us, and we were just sitting there talking about, life, our kids, our husbands, and out of the blue, she stated very loudly that she was very upset with Tim. She talked about a pending divorce and how she was concerned if the kids would actually want to stay with her or if they would want to be with Tim, and she was concerned about their finances.
I think she really wanted people to know how much she was giving or how much she was doing. I believe she was trying to portray herself to be the perfect mom and the perfect family.
Barb always wanted the kids to have the best of everything. And, they drove nice cars. They had newest shoes or whatever that they wanted. She also spent a lot of time shopping for herself and also for friends. Spending money was one of her favorite things to do. She continued to become more upset about it and said that she hated him. She said it with a lot of emotion, and that if she wanted to get rid of someone, she knew she could. When she said that, I kind of chuckled because I thought, I'm sure we've all been mad at our husbands and have said that. I didn't think anything of it. I just thought she was venting.
Investigators wonder if Barb decided to make good on her threat.
We found documentation showing that the house was about to go into foreclosure. We saw credit card bills that were way past due. Barb had maxed out Tim's life insurance from $50,000 to $200,000. That had happened approximately 5 months prior to this incident. We were also able to determine that she had increased the amount on the homeowner's insurance for the residents. Knowing how far Barb and Tim were in a financial struggle, Tim was worth a lot more to her dead than alive. She was going to, quite frankly, make a good payday upon his death.
Barb's motive seems clear, but there is still no direct evidence she had anything to do with Tim's death.
A lot of it was circumstantial evidence. We needed to try to get Barb to answer our questions and tell us the truth about what took place that morning.
Investigators ask Barb to come in for a more formal round of questioning.
Hi, Barb.
You can sir.
You better don't sit that close to me.
Oh, you smell pretty good.
We wanted to get a baseline from Barb about her relationship with Tim and the family setting. Barb did admit that her and Tim had talked for quite some time about getting a divorce, but that financially she didn't know how that would work.
We probably lived paycheck to paycheck. We got behind on our mortgage and had to refinance, and some creditors.
Were you guys able to find common ground at least to get that handled?
He handled the bills for a while, and then he got tired of it and kind of half-ass handed them back to me.
Aside from confirming what police already know, Barb is not very forthcoming.
She was fine speaking with us about the relationship and the financial situation. But when we pressed her about the morning of the fire, she just started to close up.
What was the breaking point for you?
I don't have anything to say. I didn't have a breaking point.
You understand where I'm coming from?
I do.
Right? You watch the TV shows. You're in the medical field. You know they're going to be able to do toxicology and figure out what happened with him. That's going to come back on you. The fire didn't destroy his body. That's going to come back to you, and then it's just going to be evidence. I'm here so I can understand. Take me through it. What led up to that decision? Because we know...
There was no decision.
She asked to stop the interview. She told them that she wanted to go speak to her children and talk to them, and then she would come back.
It was my belief that she knew at that point that she was caught, and she wanted to tell the kids what took place before she admitted to what she had done. Prior to Barb leaving the law center the day of the interview, we executed the search warrant of her vehicle and also seized her cell phone for a search warrant to be conducted on the cell phone.
The following morning, while waiting for Barb to return, investigators receive a shocking call.
At approximately 8 in the morning, dispatch received a 911 call from the mother's residence advising that Barb was having seizure-like symptoms. I recognized the address and I went to the location and observed Barb was overdosing. At that point, she was transferred to a hospital in Des Moines.
Barb had taken some type of overdose of medications. She was kept for about 10 days under observation.
Of course, in a small town, people are talking. A lot of people questioned, is she grieving? Is it because she's so heartbroken? But at this point, even though it was a few short days after Tim's passing, it was pretty evident that most people believed that it was because she was guilty of a crime that she'd committed.
With Barb Pasa in the hospital recovering from an overdose, police focus on finding evidence that she orchestrated her husband's death.
After the initial autopsy report and toxicology test did not reveal anything, we asked for an additional toxicology test to look further into other substances that may have been in his body.
The case history was that Barbara Pasa was a nurse in a medical field and had access to some of the drugs that are specifically used for anesthesia. That conversation led the laboratory to test for a drug called propofol.
Propofol is a fast-acting drug that is most commonly used to sedate patients undergoing surgery.
The injection of propofol is going to cause a person to sleep, and it can also affect the heart and lower blood pressure. It can cause an individual to stop breathing, and a sufficient concentration can lead to death.
The amount of propofol found in Tim's body was 0.18 milliliters, which is not something that a normal person would have in their system.
That analytical finding is the propofol that's present in the blood. It doesn't go to show you where the propofol is present in other parts of the body. So the finding in the blood does not account for the propofol dose that was administered.
We did interviews. We were able to determine that Tim was not a drug user. Tim was not in the medical field.
It's clear to investigators that Barb was the only person in the Pasa household that had direct access to propofol.
They spoke with hospital officials. When propofol is used, if it's in a vial and say it's 10 milliliters and they only used 5, it can only be used one time, so it was thrown in the trash.
Barb's job in the surgical center was to then dispose of those containers. The containers are such that Barb would be able to reach in and grab the small vial of propofol, stick it in a pocket, and no one would know anything different.
With Barb's access to the drug confirmed, investigators re-examine her timeline. On the morning of the fire, Barb told police she left the house a little before 7 a.m., more than 30 minutes before the fire was reported. But when police reach out to Barb's coworker, Megan DeSina, she says otherwise.
On the morning of May 5th, as I was driving to work, I happened to notice that Barb's vehicle was at home. I knew it was her vehicle based on the personalized plates that she had that spelled out Pasa.
Megan has an app on her phone that she uses for her work, and it tracks where she's at certain times. She showed us this app, and it showed that she had been by that house at about 7:22 that morning. About 10 minutes later, 7:33 or thereabouts is when the 911 call was made that there was smoke coming out of the house. That's a pretty short period of time for somebody to be there and then gone, and that also starts to tell me that fire might have been going for a while before she actually left the house.
Detectives are able to track her movements after leaving the house using her financial records.
That morning, she had gone to a ATM location here in Centerville and withdrew $200 from that ATM. We were able to also get video from that ATM, which proved it was Barb and that she was in her vehicle at 7:25 a.m. in Centerville. So having all this evidence between the autopsy, the interview, the different statements, the financial information, all led us to Barb was not being truthful with us and that Barb was involved in the death of Tim and the fire at the residence.
Armed with more solid evidence, investigators present their case to the district attorney.
I think Barb was in a bad place financially. She wanted to appear to be the perfect family, have the perfect home, the perfect cars. And I think it got to the point where she was not going to be able to uphold that appearance. And that's why she did what she did.
Barb snapped because she didn't want people to know the truth. She didn't want them to know that her life was not as it was portrayed. So based on our investigation in this case, we believe that sometime in the early morning, Barb was able to inject Tim with propofol. Once that took place, Barb then decided to try to destroy all possible evidence.
If we suspect that it was arson or whatever, usually you can see a burn pattern, but we didn't see nothing like that. So I believe that she stacked stuff up on top of him, let it be clothes, pillows, or whatever, started it on fire. I believe her intent was to burn the house down or burn it along resignation where you couldn't see what was happening and then leave.
So at this point, we believe we had enough probable cause to make an arrest for the murder and the arson.
While investigators have been gathering evidence, Barb Pasa has been in a hospital bed recovering from an overdose. When she's released on May 18, 2018, officers are waiting to arrest her.
Barb was placed under arrest and charged with the murder of Tim Pasa as well as arson.
It's a small town, so you start hearing things, about, I heard there was no smoke in his lungs and things like that. So when I heard that she'd got arrested, I was not surprised at all. I really wasn't. Angry, yes. Surprised, no.
Barb's trial begins on September 17, 2019, more than a year after the crimes took place.
Barb pleaded not guilty. At that point, she was looking at life in jail without parole on just the murder alone, plus the arson charges.
But prosecutors know their case is still largely circumstantial.
You have to convince the full jury, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the person that was charged committed the crimes that were alleged. We didn't have video of Barb lighting the fire. We have to prove that the information we have, based off of all of our investigation, leads to nobody else. It had to be her.
According to the defense, police arrested the wrong person.
One of the defenses that Barb tried to use was that her neighbor, who is also a nurse and deals with anesthesiologists, was someone that could have possibly entered the residence and injected Tim with the propofol.
There just was nothing that we found that ever showed he was involved in it.
It was determined that he actually left at 5:30 that morning of the incident to head to Des Moines for a conference. He was not around that day.
Barb chose to take the stand in her defense. She did show some emotion throughout her testimony, which was not similar to what we had seen throughout this investigation. She talked about in her previous marriage that she had lost a child at some point, which definitely is a traumatic experience.
I think She truly wanted to convince people that she was not the evil person that everybody knows that she is, by saying that she could not do that to her children or do that to Tim.
The tears that she was given, all phony. The entire thing was phony.
The question for the jury is whether or not they believe her.
The jury ended up deliberating for approximately 3 hours, came back with guilty verdicts for first-degree murder and first-degree arson, which ultimately gave Barb a life sentence plus 20 years.
In my opinion, this woman is a psychopath. Lucky for us, she's not a very smart psychopath. If she was as smart as she thought she was, Tim would have had smoke in his lungs. She didn't think that part out.
I think as a community, it kind of maybe opened some eyes a little bit more, knowing that maybe everything isn't exactly how it's portrayed.
Even though she got sent to prison for murder and arson, that was not a win. It's very sad that these children lost a father and a mother both. And the kids will remember this forever, and it's just a very, very sad ordeal.
All of them had a common interest in music. Hopefully they still do. I think they do. But he could have nurtured that a lot more had he been around and been involved with their life. And she robbed him of that.
Tim should be remembered for the great dad he was, and for the connections he had with his kids, and just how proud he was all the time of them. He would be beyond proud of the lives they're living and all their successes.
The call came in just before dawn. No panique. No shouting. Just a voice that sounded too calm for what it carried. A girl is gone. That was it. No explanation. No chaos in the background. Just a sentence that would stretch across decades like a shadow that refused to move. Ohio. Late autumn. 1999. The kind of town where nights settled quietly, where porch lights were left on not out of fear, but habit. Where everyone knew the rhythm of everyone else's life, or thought they did. Her bedroom window was open, just a few inches, enough for cold air to slip inside and settle over an empty bed. The sheets were creased, not torn. Her pillows slightly indented, as if she had just risen or been taken without resistance. No sign of a struggle. No broken lock. No forced entry. Just absence.
Clean. Silent. Impossible.
15 years old.
Known.
Liked. Ordinary in the safest way possible. She had homework waiting on her desk. A half-finished note to a friend. Clothes folded for the next day. There were plans. There was routine. There was nothing that suggested she would vanish into the night without a trace. But she did. By sunrise, the house was no longer a home. It was a scene. Officers stepped carefully, their movements deliberate, voices low, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something fragile or alert something still hiding. Every corner examined, every surface studied, but the silence held. No fingerprints out of place, no footprints leading away, no broken glass, no blood, the kind of nothing that feels deliberate. Outside, the street began to fill. Neighbors wrapped in coats, confusion etched into every face. The flashing lights of patrol cars painted the quiet neighborhood in urgent red and blue. Questions moved faster than answers. Did anyone hear anything?
See anything?
Notice anything unusual? Nothing. The timeline closed in quickly. Dinner at home. A phone call just after 9. Laughter according to the friend on the other end. Nothing strained. Nothing hidden. Lights out before 11. Then darkness. Then a gap where something should have been. And in that gap, everything disappeared. Search teams moved into the woods behind the house before the sun fully rose. Dogs picked up her scent near the back door, followed it across damp ground, through fallen leaves, past the edge of the yard, and then stopped.
Abruptly.
as if the trail had been cut. It didn't fade. It ended. A dead stop at the roadside. Detectives stood there longer than necessary, staring at a stretch of asphalt that refused to speak. If she had walked away, the scent would continue. If she had run, there would be disturbance. But this suggested something else. A vehicle. A waiting point. Or a plan. The case escalated before noon. What started as a missing person quickly became something colder. Something heavier. Media picked it up by afternoon. By evening, her face was everywhere. Printed, broadcast, repeated. A name attached to a void.
Tips flooded in.
Sightings reported from miles away. Gas stations. Shopping centers. Highways stretching toward other states. Each one followed. Each one investigated. Each one dissolving under scrutiny. Hope rising and collapsing in cycles. Inside the investigation, something else began to form. A quieter line of questioning. Not where she went, but who had access. Who knew the layout of the house. Who could move through it without triggering fear. Because nothing about that night suggested panic. Which meant one thing. She may have known the person. That idea didn't surface publicly.
Not yet.
But it lingered in every interview, every re-examined detail. Detectives began circling the inner ring. Family, close friends, neighbors, anyone who had been inside that house more than once. Anyone who could open a door without being questioned. That's when his name appeared. Not dramatically, not with alarm, just consistently. A family friend. He had been around for years. Barbecues in the summer, holiday gatherings, casual visits that blurred into routine. He wasn't just known. He was accepted.
Trusted.
The kind of presence that fades into the background because it belongs there.
He had seen her that week.
He had been in the house. He had nothing to hide. At least, that's how it seemed. When detectives first spoke to him, he was calm, cooperative. His timeline was simple. He had stopped by briefly, spoke with her parents, exchanged a few words, left early, went home. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. It fit. Too well. There were no contradictions.
No hesitations.
No reason to push further. In a case filled with unknowns, he was one of the few things that made sense. So they moved on. Because investigations follow evidence. And there was none. Days turned into weeks. The search expanded. Helicopters scanned wooded areas. Volunteers combed through fields. Divers checked nearby water. Each effort methodical. Each result empty. The town shifted, not visibly at first, but subtly. Conversations became quieter. Doors locked a little earlier. Parents called their children inside before dusk. Something invisible had entered the community, and no one knew how to remove it. Fear doesn't need proof. It feeds on possibility. The case file grew. Interviews stacked. Leads documented and dismissed. Patterns attempted and abandoned. Every theory examined. Stranger abduction. Runaway.
Accident.
Each one failing under the weight of missing pieces. But one detail refused to settle. No forced entry. It kept returning. Quietly.
Persistently.
Like a question that couldn't be answered because no one wanted to say it out loud. If no one forced their way in, then how did they get inside? The answer was simple. They didn't have to. That realization changed the tone of the investigation, even if it didn't immediately change its direction. Detectives revisited earlier interviews, looked closer at familiar faces, replayed conversations not for what was said but how it was said. And still, nothing concrete. Months passed. Winter arrived. The ground hardened. The search slowed. Media attention began to drift. New stories replaced old ones. But inside the case file, nothing moved.
No breakthrough. No discovery.
Just the same unanswered question, written in different ways. Where did she go? The family friend remained present, supportive, visible. He attended gatherings, spoke with investigators when asked, offered thoughts, memories, small details that seemed helpful but never decisive. He was exactly what you would expect from someone close to the situation. And exactly what you wouldn't suspect. Years slipped by. The case cooled not because it was solved, but because it resisted resolution. Evidence aged. Witness memories blurred. The urgency faded into persistence. Then into routine. Then into something quieter. A cold case.
But cold didn't mean dead.
It meant waiting. Technology advanced. DNA analysis improved. Old evidence was reprocessed. Fibers re-examined. Partial prints reconsidered. Tiny fragments that once meant nothing were given new attention. Most led nowhere. Until one didn't. It wasn't dramatic.
No sudden confession.
No single piece that changed everything. Just a shift. A rereading of something already there. An old statement. A neighbor. She had been awake that night. Later than usual. She remembered a car. Parked briefly near the house. Engine running. Lights off. At the time, it meant nothing. A passing detail in a quiet town. But years later something about it stayed. The shape. The position under the streetlight. The way it didn't belong. Even if she couldn't explain why. Investigators took another look. They traced vehicles connected to the people in the victim's life. One by one. Methodically. Cross-checking old registrations, ownership records, timelines. And then it aligned. Not perfectly. But enough. The description close enough to matter. It pointed back to him. The family friend. For the first time, his presence in the case shifted from background to focus. Not accusation.
Not yet.
But attention. And attention changes everything. They brought him in again. Years older. Still composed. Still cooperative. His story remained the same.
Clean.
Consistent. Unshaken by time. But this time, they weren't just listening. They were comparing. Every word measured against the past. Every detail checked against what had already been said. Looking for movement. For cracks. For anything that suggested the story wasn't as solid as it appeared. At first, nothing. Then something small. A time that shifted. A detail that softened. A memory that didn't land exactly where it once had. Individually meaningless. Together not. Because truth doesn't change. Only stories do. The room felt different after that. Not heavier. Not louder. Just sharper. As if the edges of the case had finally come into focus. Outside, the town had moved on. New families. New routines. The house no longer looked the same. But inside the investigation, the past had returned with clarity. Not as memory. As evidence. And at the center of it, the one person who had always been there. Quiet.
Trusted.
Overlooked.
Until now.
The cold case wasn't just reopening. It was beginning to breathe again. And with it the possibility that the truth had never been far away at all. The second interview didn't begin with accusation. It began with silence. A quiet room. Fluorescent light humming overhead. A recorder placed carefully on the table, its red steady, patient. Across from the detectives, the family friend sat exactly as he had years before. Hands folded, posture relaxed, eyes steady. No visible fear.
No urgency.
Just a man who had answered these questions once and expected to answer them again. But this time, the questions had changed. Not in words, in weight. They started where they always start, routine. Familiar ground. Where were you that night? What time did you leave?
Who did you speak to?
The same timeline, laid out again like a map that had already been drawn. And at first it matched. He spoke clearly.
No hesitation.
He had stopped by the house, stayed briefly, talked with the parents. exchanged a few casual words. Nothing unusual. Nothing memorable. He left early, drove home, watched television, went to bed. A simple night. A forgettable night. That was the problem. Because nothing about that night should have been forgettable. The detective leaned forward slightly. Not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to narrow the space between question and answer. Do you remember seeing her that evening? A pause.
Small.
Measured. Yes. Did you speak to her? Another pause. Slightly longer. Briefly. What did you talk about? A shift in his shoulders. Almost invisible. Nothing important. Nothing important. The phrase lingered in the room longer than it should have, because everything about that night was important now. Every word, every glance, every moment that had once seemed ordinary. The detective let the silence stretch, not filling it, not rescuing him from it. People talk to escape silence. Eventually he did. She seemed fine, he added. Normal. Normal. That word had been used before. By friends. By teachers. By everyone who last saw her. It had become a shield. A way to explain the unexplainable. If she was normal, then whatever happened came from outside. From somewhere else. From someone else. The interview continued.
Slowly.
Methodically. Each answer recorded. Each detail placed against the version he had given years earlier. That's when the edges began to shift. Last time, you said you left around 8:30. A blink. Was it? That's what you told us. A longer pause now. His fingers tightened slightly against each other. It might have been later. I didn't check the time. A small change. Almost nothing. But time matters. Because time creates windows. And windows create opportunity. The detective nodded, as if accepting the adjustment, as if it didn't matter. But it did. It moved him closer to the last confirmed moment she was seen. Narrowed the gap between presence and disappearance. Did you go inside the house that night? Yes. Which rooms? The living room, kitchen. Anywhere else? A hesitation. Barely there, but enough. I don't think so. You don't think so? Not no. Not clearly. Just uncertainty. And uncertainty, in a case like this, is a fracture. The interview ended without confrontation.
No accusations.
No raised voices. Just a man leaving the room believing he had done what he had always done, cooperated. But outside that room, something had changed. The timeline was no longer stable. Detectives returned to the case file with new eyes. They didn't look for new evidence. They looked at old evidence differently. The statements, the reports, the small details that had once been background noise. Now they stood out. The open window. It had always been treated as a possible entry point, a theory, a suggestion. But what if it wasn't entry? What if it was exit? Or staging? They reconstructed the room again. Photographs laid across the table. Measurements taken years earlier revisited. The height of the window, the angle, the lack of disturbance on the ground outside. It didn't feel right. Not for an entry. Not for a hurried escape. It felt intentional. Like something meant to be seen. Or believed. If the window wasn't how someone got in, then the question returned. How did they enter? And the answer returned with it. They didn't have to. They already had access. The investigation narrowed further. Not publicly. Quietly. Internally. A shift in focus, so subtle it wouldn't alert anyone watching from the outside. But inside the department, the case was no longer drifting. It was moving. They pulled phone records again. Old data, limited by the technology of the time, but still holding patterns. Calls made. Calls received. gaps in communication that now seemed less random. The call she made that night, 9:12 p.m. Her last known conversation. They listened again. Not for content, for tone. Background noise, movement, anything that suggested she wasn't alone. At one point there was a sound, faint, indistinct, something like a door, or a shift in the room. The friend on the line hadn't noticed it. It hadn't meant anything then. Now it did. They isolated it, amplified it, played it back over and over. A subtle change in her voice followed. Not fear, not alarm, just awareness. As if someone had entered the space. Someone she recognized. Because she didn't react. That detail settled heavily into the room. She wasn't afraid. Which meant she didn't see a threat. Which meant the threat didn't look like one. The family friend moved further into focus. His access, his familiarity, his presence that night, the shifting timeline, the small inconsistencies. Still circumstantial. Still not enough. But building. They went back to the roadside where the scent had ended. Years had changed the landscape slightly, but the road remained. The same stretch of asphalt. The same quiet edge of the neighborhood. They stood there again, imagining the moment the trail stopped. A vehicle waiting. Engine running. Lights off. A controlled environment. Not chaotic. Not rushed.
Planned.
The neighbor's statement resurfaced. The car.
Parked briefly.
Then gone. They cross-referenced again. Ownership records. Old insurance documents. Vehicle registrations tied to him at the time. One matched closely enough to matter. Color within range. Body style consistent. Nothing definitive, but enough to place him possibly at that exact point where the trail disappeared.
Possibly.
That word carried weight now. Because possibilities, when layered, begin to form something harder.
Pattern.
They interviewed him again weeks later. Same room. Same recorder. Different atmosphere. This time, the questions pressed slightly harder. Still controlled. Still measured. But less forgiving. Did you leave the neighborhood immediately that night? Yes. Did you stop anywhere?
No.
Anyone see you when you got home? I don't remember. Another fracture. Memory fades. That's natural. But selective gaps, those matter. They asked about his vehicle. Routine. Casual. Were you driving the same car back then? I think so. You think so? It was a long time ago. Another shift. The kind that doesn't prove anything. But doesn't sit right either. They let him go again. Because suspicion isn't evidence. But evidence can come from pressure. And pressure was building. Not publicly. Not yet. But inside the case, the air was changing. Detectives began mapping his movements beyond that night. His routines. His habits. Where he had been in the weeks before. The weeks after. Looking for anything that connected. Anything that suggested preparation. Or aftermath. They found small things. Nothing explosive. But consistent. Patterns of presence. Times he had been near the house. Reasons that made sense on the surface, but accumulated into something harder to ignore. He had been close. Often. Comfortably close. Too close to be dismissed as coincidence. The case, once scattered, was tightening. Not solved. Not proven. But focused. For years, it had been a question with no direction. Now it had a center. And at that center was a man who had never left the picture. A man who had stood beside the family. Spoken words of comfort. Watched the search unfold. Watched the years pass. Watched the case go cold. all while remaining exactly what he had always been.
Trusted.
That trust was beginning to crack. Slowly. Quietly. But once it breaks, it never returns the same. And somewhere beneath the layers of time, beneath the silence and the routine and the careful words, something else was waiting. Not a confession.
Not yet.
But the shape of truth. And it was getting closer. The file didn't change overnight. It tightened. Pages that once sat quietly began to press against each other, details aligning in ways they hadn't before. Not because new evidence had appeared, but because the old evidence had started to make sense when viewed through a different lens. The kind of shift that doesn't feel dramatic until it does. The family friend was no longer a background presence. He had weight now. Not enough to charge. Not enough to accuse. But enough to study. Closely. They began with proximity. Every visit. Every recorded interaction. Every casual mention buried inside years of statements. He had been near the house more often than anyone initially realized. Not unusual for a family friend. Not suspicious on its own. But frequency creates familiarity. And familiarity creates access. Access was everything. Because nothing in that house had been forced. They mapped his movements again, this time against a reconstructed timeline of the entire evening. Not just his version, but everyone's. Parents. Neighbors. The girl's last phone call. Even the quiet gaps between events. The timeline narrowed. The window between 9:30 and 11 p.m. became critical. That was the space where she disappeared. That was the space where his story softened. He had said he left early. Now, he wasn't sure. He had said nothing unusual happened. Now there were moments he couldn't clearly place. Memory fades. That was expected. But certain memories don't fade the same way. Not when they sit next to something catastrophic. Not when they should have been anchored by what came after. Unless they were never anchored at all. The detectives returned to the house, what it had been, not what it was now. They studied the layout again. The distance from the front door to her room. The creak points in the floor. The visibility from different angles. What someone could see. What they could hear. If he entered, she would have known. If she knew, she wouldn't panic. If she didn't panic, there would be no struggle. And there wasn't. That line of reasoning settled in like a quiet truth. They pulled the original evidence logs again. Every item cataloged. Every detail documented. Dust patterns. Fibers. The position of objects in the room. Things that had once been too small to matter. Now they mattered. The window. It was still wrong. No dirt disturbance outside. No clear transfer of debris inside. If someone had climbed through, there would be trace. There always is. But there wasn't. Which meant the window was likely open from inside. After. A detail that changed the narrative entirely. Because now the scene wasn't just quiet. It was arranged. They followed that thread carefully. If the window was staged, then the person responsible had time. Enough time to think. Enough time to create a version of events that would mislead. That suggested control. Not panic. Not impulse. Control. And control pointed toward someone who felt safe in that space. Someone who didn't need to rush. Someone who believed they wouldn't be interrupted. The focus tightened again. The family friend. They brought him back in, but not immediately. Pressure works best when it builds unseen. Instead, they revisited everyone else first. Old interviews. Old witnesses. People who had once offered small details that didn't fit anywhere. Now, those details had a place. One neighbor remembered seeing him on the street more often than expected in the weeks before the disappearance. Nothing strange. Just noticeable in hindsight. A car passing slowly. A brief stop. A wave that lingered a second too long. Another recalled a conversation. Casual. Harmless at the time. He had asked about the girl's schedule,
School.
activities, when she was usually home. At the time, it was normal curiosity. Now it wasn't. Patterns began to form, not sharp enough to cut, but strong enough to feel. They examined his background more closely. Employment, relationships,
History.
looking for anything that suggested instability, anything that hinted at behavior that didn't align with the image he presented. Nothing overt. No record. No prior accusations. Just gaps. Periods where his life didn't line up cleanly. Times that weren't fully accounted for. Not proof, but absence of clarity. Absence, in this case, mattered. The investigation shifted into something quieter.
Surveillance.
Not obvious. Not aggressive. Just observation. Watching routines. Noting patterns. Waiting for something that might confirm what they couldn't yet prove. Days passed. Nothing dramatic. He lived normally. Work. Home. Routine. The kind of life that doesn't draw attention. The kind that blends into the background. But normal can be constructed. And constructed things eventually show seams. They found one. A storage unit. Not in his immediate area. Not something he had ever mentioned. It was registered under his name years earlier, around the time of the disappearance, then closed not long after. It had never been flagged. Because no one had been looking. Now they were. Records showed limited access. A few entries. Dates that aligned uncomfortably close to the timeline of the case. Not exact, but close enough to matter. They obtained a warrant to review what remained. The unit itself was empty now.
Cleaned. Cleared.
Years too late to find anything physical. But records leave traces. Payment methods. Access logs. A pattern of behavior that suggested it had been used briefly and intentionally. For what, they couldn't say. But the timing added weight. And weight was building. They brought him in again. This time, the tone was different. Still controlled. Still professional.
But direct.
Did you ever rent a storage unit? A pause. Yes. When? I don't remember exactly. Late 1999? Another pause. Longer. Maybe. What did you store there? Just personal items. What kind of items? A shift in posture. Subtle, but present. Boxes. Old things. Why did you close it? I didn't need it anymore. The answers were simple. Too simple. Because simple answers often hide complex truths. They pressed slightly harder. Did you ever take anything from the house that night? A stillness entered the room. Not visible, but felt.
No.
Immediate. Controlled. But something in the delivery tightened. They let the silence return. It stretched longer this time. Long enough to make the air feel heavier. Long enough to make every second noticeable. Do you know what happened to her? Another stillness. Another pause.
No.
Same tone. Same control. But now there was something underneath it. Not fear.
Not yet.
But awareness. He understood the direction. He understood the shift. And that changed everything. Because once someone knows they are being seen differently, they respond differently. The investigation didn't explode. It didn't break open. It tightened further. Every detail now circled him. The timeline. The access. The inconsistencies. The storage unit. The staged window. Individually, they were fragments. Together, they formed something more dangerous. A narrative. Not proven. but forming. Detectives began reconstructing a possible sequence. Not as fact, as theory. He arrives at the house. He stays longer than he originally claimed. He encounters her. She knows him. She doesn't resist. Something happens. Something that escalates beyond control, or perhaps was always intended.
He has time.
Enough to move. Enough to think. Enough to stage. The window is opened.
The scene is arranged.
He removes her. Transports her. The scent ends at the road. A vehicle waiting. The storage unit possibly part of the aftermath. It wasn't complete. There were gaps. Still too many. But for the first time, the case had direction. A path that didn't dissolve under scrutiny. A path that led back to the same place every time.
Him.
Outside, the town remained quiet. Years had softened the edges of memory. People had moved on. Or tried to. But inside the investigation, the past was no longer distant. It was immediate.
Alive.
And closing in. Because cold cases don't stay cold forever. Some of them just wait.
For the right detail.
The right question. The right moment when everything that once seemed separate finally connects. And when it does, the silence that protected the truth for years begins to break. Not loudly. Not all at once. But enough. Enough to be heard. The pressure didn't come all at once. It settled in, slow and deliberate, like something tightening its grip without being noticed until it was too late to ignore. Inside the department, the case no longer felt dormant. It felt active. Watching. Waiting for the smallest shift that could turn suspicion into certainty. They stopped looking for big breaks. Big breaks had failed them for years. Now they focused on the small things, the details that didn't scream, but whispered. The kind that only become dangerous when they repeat. The family friend was now the center of those repetitions. Every time they circled back, his presence was there. In timelines. In proximity. In access. In memory. Not loud. Not obvious. But constant. And constancy, in a case like this, is never accidental. They re-examined his statements again, this time isolating tone. Not what he said, but how he said it. Linguistic patterns. Stress points. Moments where his voice flattened, where it tightened, where it slowed just slightly as if navigating something unstable. It wasn't proof. But it was direction. One particular moment stood out. When asked about her room. Years earlier, he had said he never went near it. Now, he wasn't sure. I don't think I went upstairs. Not don't. Not never. Just uncertainty. That shift mattered more than any direct contradiction, because it suggested something deeper than memory loss. It suggested adjustment. And adjustment suggests awareness. They built a behavioral profile quietly, layering it over everything they already knew. A man comfortable in familiar spaces. A man who understood routines.
Who blended in.
Who didn't draw attention. A man who could move without being questioned. That kind of person doesn't force entry. They don't need to. They wait. They observe. They choose the right moment. And when that moment comes, they act without resistance. The theory hardened. Not confirmed. But sharper. They revisited the timeline again, narrowing the critical window even further. 9:45 p.m. to 10:30 p.m. That was where everything compressed. Her last known contact. His uncertain departure. The silence that followed. Inside that silence, something happened. They returned to the phone call one more time. 9:12 p.m. The last conversation. They had already isolated the background noise, the faint sound, the shift in her voice. But this time, they listened for rhythm, for pacing, for breathing. There was a moment, brief, almost invisible, where her tone changed. Not fear. Recognition. As if someone had entered the room, and she adjusted. Not startled. Not alarmed. Just aware. That moment echoed louder than any scream. Because it confirmed something they had only suspected. She knew the person who entered. And she trusted them enough not to react. That narrowed the field to almost nothing. And placed him directly inside it. They moved to physical evidence again. Not new evidence. Old evidence, reinterpreted. The positioning of objects in her room. The lack of disturbance. The way the bed was left. The angle of the window. Everything suggested control.
No chaos. No struggle.
Just removal. As if she had been guided. Or convinced. Or caught off guard in a way that didn't trigger immediate resistance. They reconstructed it again. He enters the house. He moves quietly but not carefully enough to hide from her, because he doesn't need to.
He speaks.
She responds. There is no panic.
No alarm.
And then something shifts. Something that turns familiarity into danger. But by the time it becomes clear, it's already too late. The theory wasn't perfect. But it fit. Too well. They needed more. Circumstantial weight wasn't enough to move forward. They needed something that could stand, something that could hold under pressure. So they looked beyond the night itself. They looked at him. Not just who he was then, but who he had been before. Patterns don't begin with a single event. They build. They found small things. Nothing criminal. Nothing actionable. But telling. Moments where boundaries blurred. Situations where his presence lingered longer than expected. Interactions that, at the time, felt harmless, but now carried a different tone. A comment remembered differently. A glance that lasted too long. A familiarity that edged into something else. No one had reported it. No one had questioned it. Because trust covers everything, until it doesn't. They spoke to people again.
Carefully.
Without revealing direction. Without naming suspicion. Just questions. Open-ended. Letting memory do the work. Some dismissed it. Some didn't remember. But a few paused. And in those pauses something surfaced. Discomfort. Not clear. Not defined. But real. The kind of feeling people ignore in the moment because it doesn't make sense. Until later.
Until now.
Those fragments added to the weight. Still not proof. But pressure. And pressure was exactly what they needed. They brought him in again. Fourth time. Same room. Same recorder. But this time, the air was different. Not tense. Focused. He felt it. Before the first question. People always do. Let's go over that night again. A nod. Controlled. Prepared. But preparation only works when the ground doesn't shift. And this time it did. You said you didn't go upstairs. A pause. I don't think I did. But you're not sure. I just don't remember clearly. Do you usually forget where you are in someone's house? A flicker.
Small.
But there. I was there many times. It blends together. Blending. Another adjustment. Another step away from certainty. They pressed. Not hard. Just enough. Did you ever enter her room? Silence. Longer now. I don't recall. Not no. Not denial. Distance. Careful distance. The detective let the silence stretch again. Then shifted. Your car was seen near the road that night. A stillness. This time it held. I drove home. Did you stop?
No.
Not even briefly?
No.
The answers came faster now. More controlled. More precise. Because now he understood the direction. And when people understand direction, they try to steer away from it. But steering creates movement. And movement leaves tracks. They didn't challenge him directly. Not yet. Instead, they introduced something new. The storage unit. A pause. Different this time. He wasn't expecting that. You had one in late '99. Yes. What did you keep there? Just old things. What kind of things? Boxes. Did you visit it after that night? A flicker in his eyes. Quick. But undeniable. I don't remember. Memory again. But selective memory doesn't protect, it exposes. Because forgetting the wrong things at the wrong time creates its own pattern. They let him go. Again. But this time, it wasn't a reset. It was escalation. Outside the room, the case had shifted into something sharper. They weren't asking if he could be involved anymore. They were asking how to prove it. They began building a timeline around him, not just that night, but the days that followed. Movements, gaps, opportunities. Every hour accounted for or questioned. There were gaps. Not large, but enough. Enough to suggest time unaccounted for. Time where something could happen. Time where something could be hidden. They returned to the storage unit records again. Access logs. Dates. Times. One entry stood out. 2 days after the disappearance. Late evening. A visit that lasted less than an hour. Then nothing. Then closure. It wasn't proof. But it was timing. And timing in a case like this is everything. The theory sharpened further. He doesn't act in panic. He acts with purpose. He removes her. He secures what he needs to. He uses the storage unit temporarily. Then clears it. Then disappears back into normal life. And waits. Because waiting is easy when no one is looking. But now they were. And everything he had done to stay invisible was beginning to surface.
Piece by piece. Detail by detail.
The case wasn't solved.
Not yet.
But it was no longer lost. It had direction. It had focus. It had pressure. And pressure changes people. Even the ones who have stayed calm for years. Even the ones who have built their lives on control. Because control eventually slips. And when it does, the truth doesn't rush out. It leaks. Slowly. Quietly. Until there's enough of it that it can no longer be contained. And they were getting close. Closer than they had ever been. To the moment where silence breaks. And everything hidden finally has nowhere left to go. The shift wasn't visible from the outside. The town still moved at the same pace. Morning routines, quiet streets, familiar faces passing without hesitation. But inside the investigation, something had crossed a line. It was no longer about whether the truth existed. It was about how close they were to forcing it into the open. Pressure had a direction now. And it pointed straight at him. They stopped asking broad questions. No more general timelines. No more open-ended recollections. Every question now had a purpose. Every detail had a place it needed to fit. And when it didn't, it stood out. They returned to the night again, but this time not as a sequence. As a structure. What had to happen, what couldn't happen, what made sense only if something else had already occurred. The window was the starting point. It had always been wrong. Now it was undeniable. They brought in a reconstruction team, not to reinvestigate the obvious, but to challenge assumptions. The angle of the opening, the position of the latch, the lack of external trace. Everything pointed in one direction. It wasn't entry. It was staging. And staging requires time. Not seconds. Minutes. Enough to think. Enough to adjust. Enough to create a narrative that would mislead. That meant whoever did it wasn't interrupted. Which meant they were comfortable. Which meant they believed they were alone. Or safe. Or both. They walked through it again. Step by step. He arrives. He stays longer than he claims. He moves through the house without resistance. He enters her space. She recognizes him.
No panique. No alarm.
Then something changes. Something irreversible. From that point forward, everything is controlled. The removal. The staging. The exit. It fit too well to ignore. But fit isn't proof. And they needed proof. They turned back to him, but not immediately. Instead, they expanded the circle outward again. Not to find a new suspect, but to eliminate every remaining alternative. Stranger abduction. Still no evidence. No forced entry. No foreign prints. No vehicle traces outside what had already been considered. Runaway. Dismissed years ago, but revisited anyway.
No packed belongings.
No contact. No financial activity. No sightings that held under scrutiny.
Accident.
Impossible under the conditions. Everything circled back. Again. And again. And again. Until the case felt less like a question and more like an answer waiting to be proven. They brought him in for the 5th time. No warning.
No build-up.
Just a call. He agreed as he always had. Because refusal would raise suspicion. And he had built his entire position on the absence of it. Same room. Same recorder. But this time, the distance between them felt smaller. Not physically. Psychologically. He knew. They knew. And the space between those two understandings was where everything would break. Let's talk about the window. A pause. Short. Measured. What about it? You said you never went upstairs. I don't think I did. But the window was opened from inside. Silence. Not long. But enough. I wouldn't know anything about that. A clean answer. Too clean. Because it didn't engage. It deflected. They shifted. You were comfortable in that house. Yes. You knew the layout. I had been there before. You could move through it without drawing attention. A slight tightening in his jaw. I suppose. Would she have been afraid of you?
No.
Immediate. Instinctive. Truthful. And that was the point. Because fear wasn't part of the equation.
Trust was.
They let that settle. Then moved again. You were one of the last people to see her. I don't know about that. You were there that night. Yes. And your timeline has changed. A pause. Longer now. I told you I don't remember everything clearly. But you remember enough to know you didn't do anything. The room tightened. Not visibly. But it was there. The first direct edge. I didn't do anything. The tone shifted.
Slightly.
More controlled. More deliberate. Less casual. Because now it mattered. Now every word mattered. They leaned in just enough. Then help us understand what happened. Silence. Longer than before. He looked down briefly. Then back up. I can't. Not won't.
Can't.
A small difference. But in that room, small differences carry weight. They let it go.
For now.
Because pushing too hard too soon closes doors. And they needed them open. Outside the room, the case moved faster. They began building a prosecutable structure. Not just theory. Not just suspicion. A sequence that could be presented, defended, understood. They needed something tangible. So they went back to physical evidence again.
The bed.
The positioning. There had been a slight shift in the sheets. Not consistent with someone leaving voluntarily. Not consistent with someone climbing out a window. But consistent with interruption. With someone rising quickly. Or being pulled. It was subtle. But it aligned. They examined fibers again. Clothing.
Bedding.
Anything that could have transferred. Time had degraded much of it. But not everything. There were traces. Indistinct. But present. And when compared against known samples, they didn't exclude him. Not confirmation. But not elimination. And in a case like this, that mattered. They moved to the vehicle again. His vehicle. Old records. Maintenance logs. Ownership transfers. Anything that could place it more precisely. One detail surfaced.
A repair. Interior cleaning.
Days after the disappearance. Not unusual. People clean their cars. But timing. Timing mattered. They tracked down the service location. Records were limited. Years had erased most of it. But one employee remembered. Vaguely. A car brought in late. Interior needing attention. Nothing extreme. But noticeable. At the time it meant nothing.
Now. It did.
They added it to the structure. Another piece. Another weight. Another point that didn't stand alone but didn't disappear either. They watched him more closely now. Not just movement. Behavior. Subtle changes. Routine disruptions. Anything that suggested pressure was getting through. At first nothing. He held. Consistent. Controlled. The same man he had always been. But pressure doesn't always show immediately. Sometimes it builds beneath the surface. Sometimes it waits. And then it leaks. They saw it in small ways. A missed routine. A longer pause before answering a simple question. A glance that lingered just a second too long when certain topics came up. Nothing dramatic. But consistent. And consistency, again, mattered. They brought him in again.
6th time.
This time, they didn't start with questions. They started with silence. Letting him sit. Letting the weight of the room settle. Letting him feel the difference. Then, we know the window was staged. No response. We know she wasn't afraid. Still nothing. We know you were there.
A breath. Slight.
But visible. And we know your story has changed. He looked at them. Finally. Not defensive. Not aggressive. Just aware. I've told you everything I know. The same line. But now it sounded different. Not like truth. Like defense. And defense means pressure is working. They didn't push further. Not yet. Because they were close. Closer than they had ever been. To the point where something would shift. Not because they forced it, but because it couldn't hold anymore. The case was no longer cold. It was active. Alive. And closing in. Because the truth, no matter how carefully it's hidden, has a way of surfacing. Not all at once. Not cleanly. But piece by piece. Until the weight of it becomes too much to carry. And when that moment comes, even the most controlled story begins to break. The investigation reached a point where waiting became a strategy. For years, the case had been defined by what was missing. No clear suspect. No confirmed sighting. No final answer. Every path seemed to disappear into darkness. But now, for the first time, investigators weren't chasing shadows. They were following a pattern. And patterns leave trails. The family friend had spent years surviving because nothing about him looked dangerous. He was familiar, predictable, someone people trusted without hesitation. Someone who stood close enough to the tragedy to appear supportive, but far enough away to avoid suspicion. That position had protected him. Until it didn't. The detectives knew they were approaching a critical moment. A mistake now could destroy years of progress. A careless move could push him into silence. So they slowed down. They watched. They waited. They examined everything. Because the smallest detail could become the piece that changed everything. They returned to the original evidence room, opening boxes that had remained untouched for years. Old photographs, interview recordings, handwritten notes from investigators who had since retired. Evidence collected at a time when technology couldn't fully understand what it was seeing. Back then, the case had been limited by what science could reveal. Now science had changed. And old evidence was being given a second life. The bedroom photographs became a focus again. The placement of objects. The position of clothing. The condition of the window. Every image was studied as if the first investigation had missed something hidden in plain sight. One detective noticed something that had never felt important before. The room did not look like the scene of a sudden disappearance. It looked like a room where someone had tried to create that impression. There was a difference. A person leaving voluntarily creates one type of chaos. A person being taken creates another. And someone trying to make investigators believe a certain story creates something else entirely. A performance. The question became unavoidable. Who had the knowledge to create that performance? Not a stranger. A stranger would not know what details mattered. A stranger would not know the house. A stranger would not know the family. A stranger would not know what would look normal. But someone close would. Someone who understood the environment. Someone who had been welcomed inside. Again, the investigation returned to him. The family friend. They began looking into the days before the disappearance. Not just the night itself. The preparation. Because some crimes begin long before the moment they happen. They begin with observation. They reviewed witness statements from the weeks before. Small conversations. Casual interactions. Moments that had seemed meaningless at the time. One person remembered him asking unusual questions. Nothing suspicious on the surface. Just curiosity. What time was she usually home? Was she going to school events? Who did she spend time with? Questions that could easily belong in a normal conversation. But viewed differently. They carried another meaning. Investigators understood something important. People rarely reveal their intentions directly. They reveal them through repetition. Through attention. Through what they choose to notice. And he had noticed a lot. They also revisited the relationship between him and the family. For years, everyone described him the same way. Helpful,
kind,
reliable. But detectives began separating reputation from reality. Because reputation is built from what people see. Reality exists in what people don't. The more they looked, the more they noticed the same contradiction. He was trusted by everyone. But nobody truly knew him. That realization changed the tone of the investigation. The person they were studying was not a stranger, hiding in darkness. He was someone who had spent years hiding in plain sight. They examined his movements after the disappearance. The days following the event. The moments when a guilty person might make mistakes. The moments when someone might panic. But there was no panic. That was one of the most disturbing details. He behaved normally. He attended conversations. He expressed concern. He spoke about hope. He acted like someone searching for answers. But investigators knew something about human behavior. Sometimes the person looking for the truth is the person who knows exactly where it is hidden. They compared his behavior with others around him. The family was devastated. Friends were desperate. Neighbors were frightened. Everyone reacted emotionally. Except him.
He was calm.
Almost too calm. Again, not proof. But another piece. Another weight. They requested additional records. Old financial information, travel history, communication records that had survived over the years. Most revealed nothing. But one timeline created questions. There was a period after the disappearance when his movements were unclear. Not impossible. Not suspicious enough by itself. Just incomplete. And incomplete timelines are dangerous. Especially when they belong to someone already surrounded by unanswered questions. They interviewed people connected to him. Former coworkers. Old acquaintances. People who knew him outside the family circle. The picture became more complicated. Some described him as friendly. Others described him as private. Some said he was difficult to read. A person who could be warm one moment and distant the next. Again, nothing criminal. Nothing that could prove involvement. But investigators weren't trying to understand whether he was a perfect person. They were trying to understand whether he was capable of deception. And everyone is capable of deception. The question is whether they have a reason. The case reached a new stage when detectives decided to confront him with information they had never revealed publicly. Not everything. Just enough. They wanted to see his reaction. The interview began calmly.
No accusations.
No pressure. Just conversation. Then they mentioned details about the scene. The window. The timeline. The vehicle. The storage unit. Each subject was introduced carefully. Each one created a small change. A pause.
A breath.
A shift in posture. Nothing dramatic, but noticeable. When they mentioned the possibility that someone familiar had entered the home, his expression changed. Only for a moment. But it was there. The detective noticed. You believe someone she trusted did this? The question hung in the air. A simple question. But a dangerous one. Because the answer mattered. I don't know. A normal response. Expected. But then came something unexpected. She trusted people too easily. The room went quiet. The detective looked up. That sentence had not been asked for. It had been offered. And sometimes, what people volunteer reveals more than what they are asked. They moved carefully. What makes you say that? A pause. I mean, she was young. True. Reasonable. But the timing was strange. The wording was strange. Because it sounded less like sympathy. And more like explanation. The interview continued for hours.
No confession. No dramatic breakdown.
No moment where everything suddenly became clear. Real investigations rarely happen that way. Truth usually arrives slowly. Through accumulation. Through pressure. Through 1,000 small details finally pointing in the same direction. When the interview ended, detectives knew one thing. They were closer. But closer wasn't enough. They needed the final connection. The evidence that could survive outside the interview room. The piece that could turn suspicion into certainty. Because the family had waited too long for another unanswered question. The community had lived too long with a mystery. And somewhere beneath years of silence, someone knew exactly what happened. The cold case had a suspect. It had a timeline. It had a theory. But it still needed the truth. And the truth was buried somewhere between memory and evidence. Between what people said and what they tried to forget. The breakthrough did not come with a confession. It did not come with a dramatic moment inside an interrogation room. There was no sudden collapse, no emotional admission, no single sentence that ended years of uncertainty. The truth came the way it often does in forgotten cases. Slowly. Quietly. Through the smallest pieces that had been ignored for too long. By this point, investigators understood something important. The case would not be solved by one clue. It would be solved by connection. Every detail had to attach to another. The timeline. The vehicle. The staged bedroom. The changing statements. The person who had remained close while everyone else searched. The family friend. For years, he had existed at the edge of the investigation. Never fully inside. Never completely outside. Always present. Always available. Always trusted. That was what made him difficult to see. Sometimes the person closest to the answer is hidden because everyone is looking for someone else. The investigators began a deeper examination of the old evidence. New forensic technology allowed them to revisit items that had once been considered useless. Samples too small. Traces too degraded. Details dismissed because they could not provide answers in 1999. But time changes investigations. What was invisible decades ago could now become a voice. The evidence from the bedroom was tested again. The results were not immediate. Days became weeks. Everyone involved understood the risk. A negative result could send the case backward again. Another dead end. Another chapter of waiting. But this time, the investigators were not relying only on science. They already had something more valuable. A pattern. The pattern of a person who had always been close. A person who knew the house. A person whose story had changed in small but important ways. A person who had spent years presenting himself as part of the search. The detectives reviewed every interview he had ever given. Not just the answers. The emotions. The timing. The reactions. They noticed something unusual. Whenever conversations focused on the victim's final hours, he redirected attention toward possibilities involving strangers. He mentioned roads. Unknown people. Random dangers. Anything that moved the focus away from the people closest to her. At first, it seemed natural. People often fear what they don't understand. But detectives noticed a pattern. He was not simply suggesting possibilities. He was guiding the conversation. And guidance can reveal intention. They looked again at his first statement from 1999. One sentence stood out. He had described the evening as completely normal. Nothing strange. Nothing memorable. But later interviews contained details he claimed to remember clearly. A conversation. A reaction. A small moment. The contradiction was subtle, but important. If the night was so ordinary that he remembered nothing, how did he remember certain details so precisely? Unless those details mattered. Unless he had chosen which memories to keep. Investigators returned to the vehicle evidence. The car that had been seen near the neighborhood. For years, it had been only a possibility. A vague description. A forgotten observation from a neighbor who never imagined it would become important. But now, with a family friend under renewed scrutiny, that memory became critical. They reconstructed the vehicle. The model. The color.
The year.
The condition. Then they compared it with every vehicle connected to him at the time. The match was not perfect, but it was close. Close enough to reopen a question. Why was his vehicle consistent with the only unknown vehicle reported near the disappearance? He had an explanation. A simple one. Many people owned similar cars. And that was true. But investigators had learned something over the years. Truth rarely hides in one detail. It hides in combinations. One coincidence means little. 10 coincidences become something else. They searched deeper. They examined his movements after the disappearance. The days when the town was flooded with volunteers. The days when the family waited beside the phone. The days when investigators believed the person responsible was already gone. But what if they weren't? What if they stayed? What if they watched the investigation from the inside? That possibility changed the entire emotional weight of the case. Because it meant the family friend had not simply avoided suspicion. He had lived beside it. He had watched people search. He had heard theories. He had heard fears. He had heard investigators discuss what they knew. And what they didn't. For years. That thought disturbed everyone involved. Because trust is not just a feeling. It is access. And access can become opportunity. The investigators began preparing for another interview. But this one would be different. They were no longer trying to understand what happened. They were testing whether he could continue maintaining the story. They wanted to see what happened when the walls moved closer. The room was prepared. Recorder on.
Documents ready.
The family friend arrived on time.
Come.
As always. He greeted investigators politely. As always. But this time, the atmosphere was different. The detective started with a simple statement. You've helped this investigation for many years. A nod. Yes. You've answered every question. Yes. You've said you want the truth. Yes. A pause. Then help us understand something. The detective placed a document on the table. Not evidence.
Not yet.
Just a timeline. You said you left earlier than this. He looked down. A few seconds passed. I may have been mistaken. There it was again. The adjustment. The escape route.
A mistake.
A memory problem. A misunderstanding. Always a reason. But never a clear answer. The detective continued. You understand why that matters. No response. Because every time we revisit this night, your timeline changes. Silence. You were there. Yes. You knew the home. Yes. You were trusted. Yes. The detective leaned slightly forward. And someone took advantage of that trust. The family friend stared back. No reaction. Or almost none. But investigators had learned to watch for almost. Because almost is where people reveal themselves. The interview continued. They asked about the victim. About their relationship. About his feelings toward her. His answers were careful. respectful, appropriate. But one thing became obvious. He spoke about her disappearance more easily than he spoke about her. Not about who she was. Not about memories. Not about moments. Only about the event. The mystery. The investigation. The questions. The disappearance itself. A person who cared might remember the person. A person hiding something might focus on the incident. It was not proof. But it was another piece. After the interview, detectives met privately. The case had reached a dangerous point. They had enough to believe. But believing was not enough. They needed something undeniable. Something that could finally answer the question the family had carried for years. Where did she go? And who took her? The investigation moved forward again. Records were requested. Additional searches authorized. Old information was reopened. The past was being forced into the present. Because somewhere in those forgotten details was the missing connection. The one piece that would finally transform suspicion into truth. And then, it appeared. Not where they expected. Not from the original evidence. Not from the famous clues everyone had talked about for years. It came from something almost forgotten. Something buried inside the thousands of pages created by a case that had refused to die. A detail written down, then ignored.
A name. A date.
A small inconsistency. The kind of thing that disappears in a mountain of information. But now, investigators knew where to look. And when they found it, the entire case changed. Because the person who had been hiding behind trust for years was about to face the one thing he had avoided since 1999. A question that had waited decades for an answer. What really happened that night? The forgotten detail sat inside the case file for years. A single line. A small note written by an investigator who had worked the case in its earliest days. A detail that had never been considered important enough to become a headline. Never dramatic enough to attract attention. Never strong enough by itself to change the direction of the investigation. But cold cases are not solved by dramatic moments. They are solved by the things everyone else stopped looking at. The note mentioned a brief interaction. Something that happened shortly after the disappearance. Something the original investigators recorded, then moved past because they were overwhelmed by hundreds of other leads. At the time, it seemed ordinary. Now, it felt different. The family friend had known a detail about the scene before investigators had publicly released it. A detail he should not have known. It was not a confession. Not even close. But it was the kind of information that makes investigators stop and ask one question.
How?
How did he know? They went back through the original interviews, searching for the exact moment, the exact words, the exact sequence of events. And there it was, hidden in plain sight. During an early conversation, before certain information had been shared publicly, he referenced something about the bedroom. Something about the condition of the room. Something only someone who had seen it firsthand should have known. The detectives read the statement again. Then again. The room became quiet. Because sometimes the most important evidence does not arrive with a dramatic discovery. Sometimes it arrives as a realization. A sentence that was meaningless for 20 years suddenly becomes impossible to ignore. They compared it with the official timeline. When did police discover that detail? When was it released? Who had access? The answers narrowed the possibilities. And once again, they returned to him. The family friend. For years, he had survived because he occupied a unique position. He was close enough to know things, but close enough that nobody questioned why. That was the danger. Familiarity had protected him. But now familiarity was becoming the reason investigators were looking closer. They began examining every piece of information he had provided over the years. Not just statements, predictions, suggestions, comments. Every time he spoke publicly or privately about the case, they found something unsettling. He often spoke as if he understood the investigation from the inside. He knew which theories investigators had considered. He knew which leads had failed. He knew which details bothered detectives. At the time, everyone saw it as concern. A person desperate for answers. But now they considered another possibility. What if he wasn't learning about the investigation? What if he was remembering it? That question changed everything. The detectives requested additional records. Old communication logs. Archived reports. Documents from the first weeks after the disappearance. They built a timeline not of the victim, but of him. Where was he?
Who did he speak to?
What did he know? When did he know it? The answers created a disturbing picture. He had been involved in conversations about the case almost immediately. He had followed the search closely. He had remained near the center of events. Always present. Always informed. And always one step ahead of suspicion. The investigators understood something important. Someone hiding a secret does not always disappear. Sometimes they stay. Sometimes they watch. Sometimes they become part of the story everyone believes. The next step was surveillance. Not because they expected him to run. Because they wanted to see how he lived under pressure. People can maintain a story for years. But pressure changes behavior. Small things. Tiny mistakes. A forgotten routine. A conversation that happens when someone believes nobody is listening. They monitored his activities quietly. Nothing happened at first. He continued living normally. Work. Home. Daily routines.
No panic. No sudden movements.
But then something changed. He began asking questions. Not directly.
Carefully.
He contacted people connected to the case. Asked about whether anything new had been discovered. Asked if investigators had found anything. Asked if the family had heard from police. Questions that sounded innocent. But investigators noticed something. He was not asking what happened. He was asking what they knew. That difference mattered. Because innocent curiosity looks forward. Fear looks backward. They prepared another interview. But before bringing him in, they made one more move. They re-examined the physical evidence. The samples from the bedroom. The items collected years earlier. The evidence that had survived decades inside storage. Technology had advanced again. And this time, something appeared. A trace. Not a complete answer. Not enough to solve the case by itself. But enough to create a connection. The forensic team compared the result with available samples. The outcome was complicated. Not a perfect match. But not meaningless. The evidence could not prove everything. But it supported what the timeline had been suggesting. Someone familiar had been there. Someone who belonged in that environment. Someone who was not an outsider. The investigators now had 3 separate paths pointing in the same direction. Behavior. Timeline. Evidence. 3 different roads. 1 destination. The family friend. The interview room felt different when he returned. He noticed immediately. People always notice when the atmosphere changes. The detective did not begin with questions. He began with information. We found something. Silence. The family friend looked toward him. What? The detective watched his reaction carefully. Not the answer. The reaction before the answer. Fear does not always appear as panic. Sometimes it appears as calculation. What did you find? The detective waited. Then placed documents on the table. We found inconsistencies. The man looked down. Not surprised. Disappointed. Almost. As if he already understood. The detective continued. For years, you told us you wanted answers. A pause.
Ido.
But every answer you gave created more questions. No response. You knew details before they were released. A small movement. Almost nothing. But enough. The detective continued. You were there. Yes. You had access. Yes. You changed parts of your timeline.
No.
The answer came quickly. Too quickly. The detective stopped. Because the reaction itself had become information. They moved through the timeline again. Slowly.
Carefully.
They showed him contradictions.
Dates. Times.
Statements. Not accusations. Just facts. And facts are difficult to argue with. For the first time, the family friend seemed less like someone answering questions, and more like someone defending a position. The interview lasted hours. Still no confession. Still no final answer. But something had changed. The investigators no longer felt like they were searching for a direction. They had one. The question was no longer whether he was connected. The question was what exactly happened. Because somewhere between the last phone call, the open window, the waiting vehicle, and the missing years, there was a moment when everything changed. A moment only one person could explain. And that person had spent decades avoiding it. But time had done something unexpected. Time had not erased the truth. It had preserved it. Every mistake, every inconsistency, every forgotten detail, all of it had waited. And now the past was catching up. The cold case that had haunted Ohio for years was no longer a mystery drifting in darkness. It was becoming a story with a final chapter. But before that chapter could be written, investigators needed one last thing. The piece that would connect everything. The evidence that would finally answer the question the family had asked since 1999. Where was she? And who was responsible? The final piece of the investigation did not come from a dramatic confession. It did not come from a moment where the suspect broke down and revealed everything hidden for decades. Instead, it came from patience. From investigators refusing to let the smallest unanswered questions disappear. Because by this point, they understood something that every cold case eventually teaches. The truth rarely hides in one place. It hides in the spaces between details. And for years, the spaces had been ignored. The family friend had built his life around those spaces. The uncertainty. The missing minutes. The forgotten conversations. The assumptions people made because they trusted him. But now those same gaps were becoming the foundation of the investigation against him. Detectives returned to the timeline one more time. Not the timeline he provided. The timeline created by everyone else. Witness statements. Phone records. Traffic information. Old notes. Every available piece of information was placed together. And slowly, a new picture emerged. The night no longer looked random. It looked organized. There was a sequence. A beginning. A middle. An end. And at the center of that sequence was someone who knew exactly where he was. The family friend. Investigators focused on the hours before the disappearance, because they believed the answer began before the crime itself. The victim had been living her normal life. School. Friends. Family. Nothing unusual. But someone else was paying attention. Someone who understood her routine. Someone who knew when the house was quiet. Someone who knew when trust would open the door. That was the detail that disturbed investigators the most. The disappearance had not required force. It had required access. And access is something strangers rarely have. They revisited conversations from the days before. Small interactions. Small comments. One witness remembered something that had seemed meaningless at the time. The family friend had asked about her schedule. Not directly. Not suspiciously. Just casually. What time she usually came home. Whether she had plans. Who she spent time with. The kind of questions people forget. Until they need to remember. That memory became another piece. Another connection. The detectives knew they were approaching the point where they needed to act carefully. They could not rush. They could not allow emotion to replace evidence. A family had already waited years. They could not give them another disappointment. So they built the case piece by piece. The vehicle. The statements. The knowledge of private details. The timeline changes. The behavior afterward. Each element stood alone. But together, they told a much darker story. They prepared a final interview. Not because they expected answers. Because they wanted to see what happened when every escape route disappeared. The family friend arrived. Older now. Decades had passed.
His appearance had changed.
But his confidence remained. That was one of the things investigators found most unsettling. He had lived with the secret or the accusation for so long that he had learned how to exist beside it. The interview began quietly.
No accusations.
No dramatic opening. Just a conversation. We want to go through the timeline one more time. A nod. Okay. They started with simple questions. Where were you? What time did you leave?
Who did you see?
The answers came smoothly. Almost automatically. Because he had repeated them many times. But repetition can become dangerous. Because the more story is repeated, the more opportunities there are for it to change. The detective pulled out the original statement. Then the later statement. Placed them side by side. You remember saying this? Yes. And later you said this. A pause. Yes. They are different. Silence. Not denial. Not explanation. Just silence. The detective waited. Finally, he responded. I was trying to remember. A familiar answer. Memory. The safest defense. But investigators had prepared for it. Because memory explains some things. Not everything. You remembered details about the house. Silence. You remembered conversations. Silence. You remembered things other people forgot. Silence. But you forgot where you were during the most important hours of the night. The room became still. The family friend looked down. For the first time, investigators saw something different. Not fear. Not guilt. Something closer to exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who had spent years protecting a story. The detective continued. You were trusted. No response. That is why nobody looked closely enough. Still nothing. You knew the family. Nothing. You knew the house. Nothing. You knew her. A long pause. Then the question. The question that had waited almost 3 decades. What happened that night? The answer did not come. Not immediately. The room stayed silent. Because sometimes silence is the loudest response. The interview ended without a confession. But investigators walked away knowing something had changed. They were no longer dealing with uncertainty. They were dealing with a wall. And walls eventually break. They continued examining the evidence. The forensic findings became stronger as more advanced methods were applied. Old samples were compared again. New databases were reviewed. The pieces moved closer together. The physical evidence did not tell the entire story, but it supported the story investigators had been building. The family friend had not simply been near the case. He had been connected to it. The prosecution team reviewed everything. Every page. Every statement. Every piece of evidence. They looked for weaknesses. Because suspicion is easy. Conviction is not. They needed to know whether the evidence could survive questions from a courtroom. Could they prove opportunity?
Yes.
Could they prove access?
Yes.
Could they prove deception?
Yes.
But could they prove exactly what happened? That was the challenge. Cold cases often reach this point. The truth becomes clear before the evidence becomes complete. Investigators may know. Families may know. Communities may know. But the law requires more. It requires proof. The pressure increased. The family friend realized something was different. The attention. The questions. The lack of distance. The years of being ignored were over. He was no longer simply a person connected to the case. He was the person investigators were watching. And that changed his behavior. Friends noticed. His confidence faded. The same calm presence people remembered for years began to disappear. The man who once spoke publicly about finding answers became quieter. More isolated. More careful. But careful people still make mistakes. And eventually, he did. A small mistake. A detail. A statement that contradicted something he had said before. Something so minor that it almost disappeared. But investigators were no longer missing details. They noticed everything. That contradiction became the final thread. They pulled. And the entire story began to unravel. The years of silence. The carefully maintained image. The trust. The unanswered questions. All of it began collapsing under the weight of one simple fact. A person can hide the truth for years, but they cannot control every version of it forever. Eventually, 2 stories collide, and one of them has to break. The cold case that had haunted the community since 1999 was approaching its final stage. The family was closer than they had ever been. Investigators were closer than they had ever been. And the person who had remained hidden behind trust for decades was running out of places to hide. Because the past had finally caught up. The evidence was moving. The questions were becoming sharper. And the silence that had protected the truth for so long was beginning to disappear. The silence that surrounded the case for decades was finally beginning to crack. For years, the disappearance had existed as a wound that never closed. A question repeated every anniversary. A photograph that remained on walls, in wallets, and in the memories of people who refused to stop searching. But now, the investigation had entered a different stage. The stage where theories become evidence. Where suspicion becomes action. Where the person who has spent years avoiding the spotlight finally finds themselves standing directly beneath it. The family friend felt the change before anyone announced it. He noticed the questions had become more precise. The conversations had become shorter. The investigators were no longer asking him to remember. They were asking him to explain. And there is a difference. Remembering allows mistakes. Explaining requires answers. The detectives continued building their case, quietly. They knew that years of investigation could collapse with one mistake. They could not rely on emotion. They could not rely on public opinion. They needed certainty. The evidence was reviewed again from the beginning. The night everything changed. The last phone call. The open window. The missing hours. The vehicle near the neighborhood. The inconsistent statements. The information he knew before he should have known it. Every piece returned to the same place. The family friend. The person who had never truly disappeared from the story. Only from suspicion. Investigators began preparing the final timeline. Not a theory. A reconstruction. They placed every confirmed event in order. The victim's final known movements. The last communication. The estimated time of disappearance. His presence. His changing account. The moments where his explanation failed to match reality. The timeline showed something disturbing. There was an opportunity. A narrow window. But enough. Enough time for something to happen. Enough time for someone familiar to enter. Enough time for the truth to be hidden behind a carefully created illusion. The investigators understood the importance of one thing. The scene had not looked like a random attack. It looked like someone had tried to control the story afterward. The open window. The lack of obvious struggle. The absence of a clear escape route. It was a message. Someone wanted people to believe something. And whoever created that message understood exactly what people would assume. That was the mistake. Because people can control what they show. But they cannot control everything they leave behind. The detectives returned to the evidence collected from the vehicle. The car had always been one of the most important unanswered questions. A witness had seen something. Not enough to identify with absolute certainty, but enough to create doubt. And doubt is where investigations begin. New forensic methods allowed investigators to examine traces that had been overlooked. Materials. Fibers. Tiny remnants that had survived decades. The results were complicated. Science did not provide a perfect movie ending. No single piece suddenly solved everything. Instead, it added another layer. Another connection. Another reason the investigation could not ignore him. The evidence supported the possibility that he had been closer to the disappearance than he admitted. And when combined with everything else, the picture became difficult to dismiss. They approached the family friend one final time. This interview would be different. There would be no casual conversation. No open-ended questions. The purpose was clear. They wanted to give him one final opportunity to explain. The room was quiet. The recorder started. The detective placed the file on the table. This case has been open for years. A pause. You know that. A nod. Yes. You have always said you wanted answers. Yes. Today, we need honesty. Silence. The detective opened the file. You told us you left earlier than you actually did.
No.
You gave different versions of the same night. I was mistaken. You knew details before they were publicly known. I don't know how that happened. You were one of the last people with access. I didn't hurt her. The sentence came quickly. Too quickly. The room went still. Because the detective had not asked that question. Not yet. The response arrived before the accusation. And sometimes, the words people choose reveal what they're defending against. The detective looked at him. Why did you say that? No answer. The family friend looked away. For the first time, the control seemed weaker. The carefully maintained calm had a fracture. A small one, but enough. The detective continued. You spent years telling everyone you were helping find the truth. No response. But what if you knew the truth already? Silence.
Long.
Heavy. The interview continued. Hours passed. The same questions returned in different forms. The same timeline examined from different angles. And slowly, the story became harder for him to maintain. Not because investigators forced him. Because reality was stronger than the version he had created. One detail contradicted another. One memory created another problem. One explanation created another question. The wall was not collapsing from pressure. It was collapsing from weight. Eventually, investigators reached the moment they had been waiting for. The moment when the case moved from suspicion into action. Additional evidence was presented. New findings. New connections. The family friend was no longer being treated as simply a witness. The investigation had changed. And he knew it. The community reacted with shock. The person many had trusted for years was now the focus of the investigation they had followed since 1999. The same person who had offered support. The same person who had appeared at searches. The same person who had spoken about finding answers. The revelation changed the way people remembered everything. Old conversations were reconsidered. Old moments gained new meaning. People wondered how they had missed it. How someone could stand so close to the pain while carrying secrets. But that is the nature of some cold cases. The hardest person to see is sometimes the person everyone believes they know. The investigation continued. Searches were conducted. Records were collected. Evidence was prepared. The final pieces were being assembled. For the family, there was no celebration.
Not yet.
Because solving a case does not erase what was lost. An answer cannot bring back years. It cannot return birthdays. Holidays. Ordinary moments stolen by uncertainty. But answers matter. Because unanswered questions create a different kind of pain. A pain without direction. Now, after decades, there was direction. There was accountability. There was finally a path toward the truth. The case that had once seemed impossible was no longer frozen in time. The cold case was moving. And the person who had remained hidden behind trust was finally being forced to face the consequences of what investigators believed had happened. But one final question remained. The question that had followed the case from the beginning. Where was she? Because finding the person responsible was only part of the story. The family still needed the truth about what happened after that night. The missing pieces. The final location. The final moments. The answers that had been taken away for so many years. And investigators knew they were close. Very close. Because once the silence breaks, the truth rarely stays buried.